We will now discuss all the events associated with a single heartbeat. We call this the cardiac cycle. Some of those events are going to be review. For example, the electrical activity represented by an ECG, blood flow from atria down to ventricles and out, systole and diastole, so contraction and relaxation of atria and ventricles. And we're also going to be adding some new parameters, such as pressure changes and volume changes that occur during a cardiac cycle. We're going to use 0.8 seconds as the length of a single cardiac cycle. That happens when the heart rate is 75 beats per minute. So each cycle is less than a second. This should make sense because if your heart rate was 60 beats per minute, a cycle would last 1 second. So we are in essence squeezing in 15 more beats in that minute, so each cycle must be less than a second. We're going to break the cardiac cycle into 3 periods or phases. The first one is called atrial systole. This is when the atria are going to be contracting, but the ventricles need to be relaxed. This is going to allow those ventricles to fill with some more blood. If you look at this ECG tracing, some of these periods or phases are described. So we're going to begin with this period, the atrial systole. We're going to start at the P wave and follow what occurs after that P wave up until the QRS. Note that when the atria are in systole, the ventricles are in relaxation or diastole. Then they switch. The atria are going to then go into relaxation, atrial diastole, while the ventricles are going to go into contraction, ventricular systole. After blood has been pumped, the ventricles go into their relaxed state, called ventricular diastole. So the 3 phases are going to be atrial systole, ventricular systole, and then finally what we will call the relaxation period, when both the atria and the ventricles are relaxed. So let's begin. We begin a cardiac cycle with the pacemaker, or the sinoatrial node. It will depolarize and then spread throughout the atria and cause atrial depolarization. That is represented by the P wave on the ECG. Following atrial depolarization, the muscle of the atria are going to contract. Therefore, this initiates atrial systole, or contraction of the atria. Contraction of the atria is going to build the pressure within the atria. This pressure is going to allow some blood to be moved from the atria down into the ventricles. That blood has to move through the AV valves, tricuspid valve on the right, mitral valve on the left. I will note that these valves are already open, so this pressure during atrial systole doesn't open the valves, they've already been opened. That occurs at the end of the previous cycle. So we'll get to that point momentarily. But during atrial systole, blood enters the ventricles, but only about 25 milliliters, or 20% of the total blood that's going to fill a ventricle. What this means is there's already blood in the ventricle, about 80%. So what can you think of? Well, the ventricles actually will fill mostly during the relaxation period. And then during atrial systole, we top them off with about 20%. So 105 milliliters are in those ventricles waiting. And then during the atrial contraction, we add 25 milliliters to reach 130 milliliters. Now, a point to make, all these volumes are what we're going to just call kind of average resting volumes. So is the 75 beats per minute. But you can imagine when your heart rate goes up, when your heart starts to beat harder, these volumes go up. This is going to mark the end of atrial systole and the end of ventricular diastole. We can see that right here on our graph. The atria are done contracting, they're going to enter diastole. The ventricles are done being relaxed, they're going to enter systole. The volume in a ventricle at this moment in time is called end diastolic volume, or EDV. You can think of this volume as being full. This is when a ventricle is full. And the volume should be the same on each side. The right ventricle and the left ventricle each have 130 milliliters of blood in them. Now it should make sense. The goal is to pump blood out of the ventricles. And that's why we enter ventricular systole. So ventricular systole is going to be the time period from the QRS to the T. During ventricular systole, the atria are going to be in relaxed state. This timing is going to be about 0.3 seconds as compared to the 0.1 second of atrial systole. The first thing we want to think of is the QRS, because in order to contract the ventricles, they need to depolarize. So we mark that as the QRS on an ECG. When the ventricles enter systole or contract, the pressure is going to build inside the ventricles. As that pressure builds, it closes the AV valves almost immediately. So we need those AV valves closed right away to prevent blood from going back up into the atria. And this is the first heart sound you can hear when listening to someone's heartbeat. It's called the S1 heart sound, or the lub of a lub-dub. It doesn't take much pressure to close the AV valves. That's why this happens almost immediately during ventricular systole. So those AV valves close first. Then there's a moment in time that since those AV valves closed and the semilunar valves are closed, all valves are closed. We call this isovolumetric contraction. What that means is the volume is the same in the ventricle as it's contracting. The volume's the same because there's no way in, no way out. All valves are closed. It's a very short moment, 0.05 seconds, but this allows pressure to build within the ventricle. And as that pressure builds and dramatically increases, that's going to give enough pressure to open the semilunar valves. Once those semilunar valves are open, the ventricle can move blood out into either the aorta, if it's the left ventricle, or the pulmonary trunk, if it's the right ventricle. But that pressure needs to build in order to open the semilunar valves, because there's a lot of pressure forcing back on the semilunar valves. There's pressure in the aorta, there's pressure in the pulmonary trunk. This pressure needs to be overcome in order to open those semilunar valves. Once those semilunar valves are open, we enter ventricular ejection, which is moving blood out of the ventricle. That's going to last about 0.25 seconds of the 0.3 seconds. And then there's a volume name. The name of the volume that is ejected from a ventricle is called stroke volume. Stroke volume for our average normal volumes is about 70 milliliters. So if you think about how much was in a ventricle and diastolic volume, that was 130. We only pump out 70. So 60 milliliters stays in the ventricle. How much pressure does it take to move 70 milliliters? Well, the left side, it takes a lot more pressure. There's more pressure in the systemic circuit than the pulmonary circuit. Therefore, there's more pressure to overcome to open the semilunar valves. It takes more pressure to move that blood because there's more blood moving in the systemic side than the pulmonary side. Therefore, the left ventricle reaches a pressure on average of 120 millimeters mercury, whereas the right ventricle only has to reach somewhere around 25 or 30 millimeters mercury. So the pressures are different, but the volume ejected is the same, 70 milliliters. The 60 that remains in the ventricle has a name. It's called end systolic volume. So we pump out 70, we leave behind 60, and if you recall, somehow we have to get up to 105, because that's the volume that's in that ventricle before the atria contract. So we are right about here now on our ECG. We've depolarized the ventricles, so we see the QRS. During this time period, we're ejecting blood. Now we need to get into a relaxed state. The relaxation period is the period in which all chambers are relaxed. All chambers are in diastole. The atria have been in diastole, so they stay relaxed. The ventricles are the ones that have to switch from contracting to relaxing. This is the most variable period of the three. This has to shorten if we're going to increase our heart rate, or this period lengthens if our heart rate goes down. So faster heart rates have shorter relaxation periods. What has to occur to relax the ventricles? They need to repolarize, and that's marked as the T wave. So we see the T wave, and then the ventricles relax. The pressure in the ventricles drops, because when a ventricle contracts, the pressure goes up. When the ventricle relaxes, the pressure goes back down. When this pressure drops below the pressure in the aorta, if you're the left ventricle, or below the pressure in the pulmonary trunk, if you're the right ventricle, the pressure outside those semilunar valves is higher, therefore it closes and pushes back onto the semilunar valves. And this is when we hear the second heart sound. Of the two heart sounds, if you think of a lub-dub, this is the dub, that second sound. It's closing of the semilunar valves during the relaxation period. There's a little bit of a change in the pressure in the aortic side. We're going to look at it as some pressure diagrams later. It's called the dichrotic notch. We'll look at that on another slide. All the valves are closed again because we closed the AV valves during ventricular systole. We just closed the semilunar valves during relaxation. So we have another isovolumetric period. But this one is called isovolumetric relaxation because the ventricles are relaxed. But the volume isn't changing because all the valves are closed. Once the pressure in the ventricles falls below the atrial pressure, the AV valves open again. So notice that opening and closing of valves is all based on the pressure differences on each side. If the pressure is lower in the ventricle than the atria, the AV valves are open. Once the pressure in the ventricle goes up, it closes the AV valves. Once those AV valves open, we can begin this filling. So remember, we're at 60. We left 60 in there after ejection. Now we're going to begin to fill again. So notice where we are. We're during this relaxation period. We haven't got to the next cycle yet. We're going to start to refill. We had 60. We're going to start to refill back up to 105. So we have to add about 45 milliliters during the relaxation period. During this period right here, before we come back around to the atrial systole, we get back up to that 105. So this is blood flowing passively from the atria right down into the ventricles. And this fills the ventricles to that 80%. mark. And then atrial systole brings you up to 100. So this helps you understand that if an individual has atrial fibrillation and their atria are not contracting properly, they still can fill. They can still fill about 80%. So atrial fibrillation is usually not a life-threatening arrhythmia because the ventricles fill during the relaxation period. Next video, we're going to start to hopefully clarify some of these things by looking at some graphs that help us interpret pressures and volumes throughout the cardiac cycle.